Hello, and welcome to another Half Pint session. So, as we've been going through Out of the Silent Planet, one of the things that I had suggested in one of the episodes, and I've been thinking about it more, were the parallels between Out of the Silent Planet and Plato's Republic. And so I turned to Google for confirmation. Had anybody else thought about this before? And surprise, surprise, I have no original thoughts. Yes, somebody had written about it before, and I have the author of the article here to talk to us about it. Matt Mikalatos, welcome to Pints for Jack.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
You're very welcome. Well, would you mind just introducing yourself to our viewers, please?
Sure. I'm Matt Mikalatos. I'm the author of 12-ish books and a number of articles. And I live in the U.S., in the Portland, Oregon area with my family and a giant rabbit. And that's me, I guess.
Yeah, I've visited Portland a couple of times. I went and looked at the line for Voodoo donuts and just concluded that it probably wasn't worth it.
It's not. Voodoo, we call, those of us who live here, we call those tourist donuts. They're very entertaining. It's a wonderful place, but the donuts are not particularly good, in my opinion.
If any of our viewers go to Portland, where should they go?
My favorite is probably Blue Star Donuts. My
I went
wife
there.
would say maybe Pips. I love Blue Star. Yeah. Do you remember what donut you got there?
Oof, no, this was quite a few years ago. But I remember looking at the line for Voodoo and thinking, this is ridiculous. But I have been thinking about donuts all day. And so I think I just picked the first thing that Google Maps returned to me.
What I love, so Blue Star does these, well, Portland's kind of a fancy food town. Like, it's cheap, but fancy, which probably is much like the town, I suppose. My favorite donut there is like a glazed donut, but instead of just a regular glaze, they put horchata in it, like the Mexican rice milk.
Nice.
And it's delicious. It's really good.
Well, there you go. Everyone, you now have some tourist advice for the next time you're in Portland. But right. let's talk about the articles that you wrote. How is it that you came to write about Lewis at all, and Out of the Silent Planet in particular?
Yeah, so, like most of your listeners, I'm guessing, I've loved C.S. Lewis since I was a kid. It was some of the early books I came across were the Narnia books, and deeply, deeply loved them my whole life. And as I got older, started realizing there were some things I had missed in those books. Surprise, when I was 7. And that some of the things I was delighted by, and some I was like, is that what Lewis really meant? But I write some science fiction and fantasy, and I often read Tor.com, which is a website that just talks about science fiction and fantasy. And I sent a note to an editor there and said, would you be interested in a series specifically about Lewis's space trilogy? Because a lot of the readers of science fiction in particular, at least in the US, I don't know if this is the same where you are, but a lot of them are not religious necessarily. So there are things about C.S. Lewis that they miss just because they're missing the religious piece of it. They don't understand some of the things he's not laying out directly. And so I think it would be interesting for me to revisit Lewis as an older person, and like what I thought of Lewis in the past and what I think now. And I could lay out some of the religious underpinnings of Lewis's work as well for those who may have missed that. And the editor wrote me back and said, what if you did all of Lewis's fantasy and science fiction and started in Narnia? And I said, that would take years, because they're like every couple weeks you do another one. They're like, that's fine. So my plan was to start in Out of the Silent Planet, and it took me 2 years of writing articles to get to it. So yeah, but I mean, it was delightful. And the audience at Tor.com is so great that so many of them know more than I do. So they would correct me as articles came out. And were really kind and generous along the way. So a really great experience for me, at least. Hopefully for some of the audience.
I love the idea of just, we're going to take your challenge and we're going to make it even harder. As someone that's running a podcast trying to get through the works of C.S. Lewis, I understand how daunting that will be. I literally have things mapped out until I'm in my 70s. So we will see what happens. Now, I'm going to have a link in the show notes so people can read your entire article. But would you mind explaining how you think Malacandra maps onto Plato's Republic? Because this is what brought me to your articles in the first place.
I was shocked as an adult by how much of Plato is in Lewis's work. Now, looking into it, you start to realize, right, he was really close friends with Charles Williams for a while, who was a Neoplatonist. And you start to recognize that, it probably isn't surprising. But, when I was 7, I didn't know anything about Plato. Well, I still don't know much. And I should say that I am an amateur when it comes to Greek philosophy, despite my Greek name. So I only have what comes naturally here.
Which is everything.
But I think the obvious, like the big piece is that we have these 3 groups of people on Malacandra who represent sort of a different function in society. And this was Plato's argument in the Republic, which we would call it now utopian literature. That those words didn't exist in Plato's time. But, in the 1500s, someone came up with this idea, utopia, which is a Greek word. It's a play, right? On utopia meaning no place. There is no place like this. But it's a homophone with the idea of a good place. So it's like this beautiful place that doesn't exist. And that's sort of what Plato is messing with. The perfect society, what would it look like? The Republic. And a big piece of it is that people are broken into these 3 categories, that you fall in one or another. And Lewis builds a society that is this, 3 different alien races, all interacting in perfect harmony in one location, which we as humans find very difficult, which Lewis discussed at length. We can't conceive of 3 alien races just getting along and enjoying each other. So what he does is he breaks them into 3 groups. And forgive me, if you know how to pronounce these alien races, please correct me.
I'll have a go.
they're amazing. But the first one, right, we have the Pififultrigi, which they live in the lower. Say it again.
Pififultrigi.
Pififultrigi. Okay, well, that's much easier than I made it for myself.
Well, to be fair, it's kind of like when I was back in England and you drive into Wales and you encounter the place names and it's just like so many consonants thrown at you, your brain just shuts down.
We have a lot of Native American words here where I live, and when tourists or others come and they massively butcher the words, you're like, "What? Why are you pronouncing it that way?" And then you learn it where you are. So the Pififultrigi, their whole thing is that they like to dig and make things. They're artisans, right? And that was kind of one section of people. And then we have obviously the people he spends the most time with are the Hrasa, which are they're the fishermen, the farmers, the warriors, which Plato, depending on your translation, right, they'd be called soldiers or warriors or auxiliaries. So it's a class that protects the Republic, right? And then the Seroni, the Sorn, which are the philosophers, the people who are in charge of history and knowledge and thought, which, of course, immediately Ransom thinks they must be in charge. And in Plato, they are. So that's the big piece. And we have a lot of other references that direction. Like the first time Ransom sees a Sorn, we see the shadow up on the wall, right? Which is certainly trying to bring to mind the cave, the idea that what if all you could see in the world are shadows on a cave, and then you come out into reality and discover that, there are things about the world you did not know. So he makes little tips of the hat like that throughout. But I think once you compare the Republic to the way Lewis has set up Malacandra, you can't help but go, oh, that was completely on purpose, of course.
But it does depart from it in a few important ways. What are they?
Yeah. I mean, I think the big one, and we see this through a lot of Lewis, is the idea of how the hierarchy works. So in Plato's Republic, the way the hierarchy works is the philosophers, you want to get a philosopher king. And they, because they're wise and thoughtful, they'll keep society in balance, and the other, kind of first among equals. They'll keep everyone doing the right thing. But in C.S. Lewis's cosmology, that's insufficient. You can't. The philosophers can't be in charge. They actually report to a higher power, a planetary power, the Oyarsa, right, who oversees. There's one for each planet. Pretty closely maps to angels. But Lewis, of course, they're not angels. They just act exactly like angels, and I often refer to them with words that are used in scripture for angels, but they're not angels. This is fiction. So they report there, and then the Oyarsa, of course, report up to an analog for God, which with Lewis, is it an analog for God or is it actually God? Like, we could debate probably. But the idea being that there's no human, there's no sentient or there's no person, embodied person in charge at the end of the day. There are spiritual beings that have authority above that.
Mm. And one of the other significant differences is also the role of poetry, which is kind of funny because we asked our listeners which of the three species they thought we were, to assign each of us Rossa, Ceroni, or Fifiltrigi. And they were absolutely spot on, I think. Although one of the things that they did is they assigned to Matt Rossa, but he doesn't like poetry. And after a little bit more thought and reading your article, poetry also had a particularly interesting place or absence in the Republic. What was it?
I love this. Lewis obviously ended up rejecting this, but Plato said that poets are dangerous because what they might do, not what they would do, but what they might do, is cause us to have compassion or interest in people who were destructive to the Republic. And that would cause things to come out of balance and basically the wheels of the Republic to come off. So basically he argued you can't have a utopian perfect society with poets in it, so they should be removed, killed, gotten rid of. Whether that was tongue-in-cheek or what he actually thought, I'm not sure. I think it could be a joke, as possible. But yeah, Lewis obviously takes the other point of view where poetry moves us toward truth as something beautiful and should be embraced. And he spends a lot of time talking about how human beings are bent, right? Meaning that we have a moral sense that is out of whack with nature and the way it should be. And so that might be his answer there too. Like, if you don't have a bent poet, it's perfectly fine. Like, healthy poets are fine. It's the bent poets that are the problem.
Hmm. And one thing that you mentioned
I think it's pretty funny though. Get rid of the poets.
Yes, I think Matt could quite get behind the idea that producing rhymed verse is a capital crime. But one thing that you mentioned in your article, which I hadn't thought of, is you connect Out of the Silent Planet to the three types of people that Plato speaks about in terms of being honor-loving, money-loving, or truth-loving. Would you mind just unpacking that a little?
Yeah, I think certainly we would be, Lewis never says this, right? So we would be digging in and thinking, I wonder if this influenced Lewis in this way. His three human characters that we have, three major human characters in this book. We have Weston, who is absolutely interested in killing every other being in the solar system if he needs to keep humanity alive. We have Divine, who is purely self-interested. There's gold in the hills. It's the American story, really. It's the march west. We'll find money and become rich. And then we have Ransom, who's just trying to figure out what's going on. He's just trying to discover reality, right? And is interested and curious and growing. So I think we have a connection there, right? We have the wealth-focused Divine, who eventually, actually, all the people of Malacandra say, the Oyarsa actually says, he's not even human, he's an animal. He's not capable of showing thought or concern for other people. All he thinks about is wealth and himself. And then we have Weston, who's very much concerned. He literally says this makes no sense from the truth point of view, right? But as an honor type thing, where he says, even if humanity were to be transformed, if it became some form but continued on, that would be worth it to kill every other thing. So even if humanity took on the form of the things he was killing, that would be fine. It's all about the protection of humanity, which in itself is bent, right? But the idea was that at least there was a core, like a seed of this idea of protection and desire for humanity to be honored. And then, of course, Ransom with his desire to find truth as he goes out into the galactic spheres. Again, is that what Lewis intended? I don't know. He was already putting a lot of meaning about colonialism and things like this on these characters. So that may be a step too far. I'm not sure.
Maybe, but I do think it's a very good bridge to talk about the other thing that you wrote about. And it's a concept that we've puzzled through as we've been moving chapter by chapter through Out of the Silent Planet. And that's the concept of Hnau. Would you mind explaining how you understand Hnau? Because the text gives us lots of clues about what is Hnau,
Right.
what isn't Hnau, Maleldil, Western Divine. What do you make of it?
Right. Well, so your first instinct, I think, as you're reading Hnau, the first thing you come to is this idea that it's like, it's like people, right? Things that are aware. So sentient, meaning people that have senses, right? Or we could go a step beyond that to say, people that are aware, awake. The problem that we start running into, and Ransom has the same question, right? He's asking them, what is Hnau? And they're like, you are. And he's like, okay. And they're like, we are. The Sorn are. Like, these different people are. So you start going, oh, it's people. And then he starts asking about these either differently bodied or disembodied, like the spiritual people, right? And he says, well, what about them? Are they Hnau? And he's told maybe, like they're not sure because they don't have young and they're not mortal. They never die, which seems to be part of the definition of Hnau. But then we see when they disembody someone, or when a Hross dies, for instance, they don't consider them to cease existing. So it's something about the spiritual part of the person too. So I think, and we should add that divine is seen when they say he's an animal. What they're saying is that he's not Hnau, because he's become broken to the point that he probably used to be Hnau. They think, they're not sure, but he certainly isn't now. So there could be human beings, people like you and me, that they would say are not Hnau because they're so badly bent that they've become broken. So I think eventually we come to something about self-aware moral beings in the world, and probably mortal would be part of it, at least for people like ourselves. I don't know, what does your community come up with?
Pretty much the same. The question of morality certainly plays into the book, but it's not really spelt out. I think in the end we've concluded that to be Hnau you have to be a person of at least some virtue, because we hear that Weston has some virtue. It's just twisted. He has set up love of his own kind as the ultimate good. So he has a virtue, but it's a virtue that's gone wild. Whereas divine, all he has is greed. So he has vice, not virtue. And so he therefore isn't Hnau.
Well, and the Malacandrins definitely think that these virtues, this moral sense, is innate, right? That if you're bent, it means that you originally were in another shape, that you've been pushed into something unnatural. And even when they're trying to explain to Ransom the whole idea, they're so apologetic. Do you remember when they're like, I don't know if you'll believe this, but like there was a guy who started eating dirt once, and they're like, or like, this is beyond imagination. There was a guy who wanted 2 mates, right? And every human being is like, oh no, I know that guy, or maybe I am that guy, or, like, so they're saying like, this is the obvious moral sense of the universe. And sometimes someone gets a little off from that somehow. So it's not even something we're trying to achieve, right? it's an innate virtue, an obvious desire to be correct in nature, which I think is so fascinating. Which is why the big speech at the end where Weston is being translated by Ransom is so delightful, because Ransom is being forced to say what Weston really means, and it starts seeming very ugly and laughable. But when he starts out, I think if you've been reading science fiction in the 1930s, you're probably like, yeah, that's exactly what we should be doing. Going to the stars. Humanity can last forever. And then, you realize we will murder anything that gets in our way, and we've been doing it for a long time. It's like, oh, that's less good. I'm not sure I like that.
And one other element to the Hnau conversation that really caused me to stumble when I first came across it is that we hear Maleldil, God, Jesus, basically.
Yeah.
He is not Hnau. And the only thing that I could really make of that is that to be Hnau, you described it as mortal, but the Eldilla are perhaps a sort of Hnau, so I wouldn't maybe say mortal, but at the very least a creature.
Right, created, yeah. I think that's fair. Yeah, that seems likely. It may be as simple as a being that has a beginning, right? Because we would assume that Maleldil doesn't have a beginning. He's eternal both directions, whereas we're eternal one direction.
Well, in the few minutes that we have left, I just wanted to give you the floor. If you wanted to say a few words perhaps about any of the other articles that you wrote about the Silent Planet. You did ones introducing the work, some on colonialism, some on intergalactic genocide, which is not something you often read in a blog post, or any of the other Lewis stuff that you've written about that you'd like to share.
Sure. I think the colonialism is I think a really important question when we look historically at where Lewis was in the 1930s, what he's writing about, what's important, what's happening in the world that we inhabit at that time. And it's actually a really forward-thinking, interesting, countercultural series of statements he's making. Almost all science fiction in the 1920s and 30s, if you went into space, it was 100% to pacify the natives of another planet, to get riches from another planet, to push humanity's influence into the stars. If they came to us, right, if they came to Mars, or if Mars came to us, they were absolutely here to do the same to us, and we would fight them tooth and nail until we won. So Lewis takes this other argument where he's like, I'm not sure we should be exporting what we have. Is it really that great? And what if other people out there are better than us? What does that mean? Which is a really fascinating, and of course, even the adoption of language in the place he's in is a huge part of colonialism. The reason English is spoken all over the world, right, is because of colonialism of one kind or another. And Lewis takes pot shots at capitalism as well, and the colonizing effects of capitalism. So that's a very strange, strong position to be taking in the 1930s, and I think it's so fascinating. It's also scholars argued this from the beginning. It's a direct response to one of H.G. Wells's books about men going to the moon. It has a structure that's almost identical, and he's definitely like stabbing the knife in occasionally there. So that's really interesting, because H.G. Wells, of course, the father of some of this sort of interplanetary romance kind of science fiction. So yeah, I think that's interesting too. Like seeing the context that Lewis was writing in, I think sheds a little light on what's happening in the book as well.
I think his Irish background gave him eyes to see that particularly clearly, because his own country had felt the effects of colonialism and, for want of a better word, racism. And so it made him sensitive to that. Plus, he was a student of history. He knew what the British Empire had done. And today it's very convenient that there's lots of parts of the world that speak English, and I don't have to learn another language like, the rest of Europe.
Right.
But on the other hand, there were some real horrific things which happened in the name of progress. Yeah,
it's really interesting. And of course, in Lewis's cosmology, it's interesting too, because as far as language goes, they already have Old Solar. Like everyone else speaks it but us, which is really fact because we've been cut off from community, the heavenly community. We're no longer part of the heavens, which is really fascinating too, that because we're so bent that we're going to have to grow back into shape to be able to be in community with the heavenly community, which is kind of beautiful and sad at the same time, which maybe that's an Irish thing too.
Matt Mikalatos, thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Well, as the landlord rings the bell for final drinks, can you please tell people where they can find out more about you, read your articles, and anything else that you've written?
Yes, so if you can spell my last name, which is a big ask, you can find me online. It's Mikalatos. All my social media, I'm Matt Mikalatos. My website is mikalatos.com. If you meet someone with the last name, they are directly related to me, and they're sad and sorry that people keep asking how to get in touch with me, but go ahead and ask. It's fine. Or if you want to go to Tor.com, just search for C.S. Lewis, and the great C.S. Lewis reread will come up. I think there's 40 articles maybe written over a couple of years about Lewis's work, and some articles which I really love, and some which I'm glad to receive your hate mail about. I think you'll find some good ones, though, hopefully.
Wonderful. Well, viewers, please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.